Started silicon molding back in 2019, where I created a brainstem model for medical students because none existed in that shape and form. So using clay and using YouTube videos, I learned as much as I could and learned how to mold this brainstem model. Problem is the silicon tore up the silicon mold. So I decided to make a new box mold using Mold Max 27T tin cure silicon, and I was able to make the mold pretty well and make it a two-part mold with scalloped keying for the mold itself. I tried to make a rotocasting rig, but that didn't turn out very well. After making the mold and trying several attempts at the rotocasting, I decided just to pour in the material and then make it all in one solid model. And so that did really good. I was able to make 25 casts for that. And with a friend, I decided to go down to Reynolds Advanced Materials in Charlotte to learn from them how to do molding and casting. And so I learned a lot of excellent techniques from them, and then was able to take those back to the medical school where I was working and do a lot of those techniques. So the idea was to make a brain cast, and I wanted to have 25 brain casts. So I started making my mold, and using the brush-on techniques that I learned at Reynolds. I was able to make a brush-on mold for this brain test, and then I used strengthening materials like gauze with the silicone, and then was able to make this first half. And I used a sort of bucket to hold the cast and hold it level, and then using mold release to separate the two layers, I applied the second half with a different color silicone and with the vent ports and a cone for the main. And it turned out great. Everything looked good. I think demolding the brain, it was amazing. I mean, I could see all the fissures inside the mold, and I thought it was going to turn out great. So got all the brain parts out of the mold, and then poured in my pigmented dragon skin. But unfortunately, the mold stuck in these very thin fissures. The fissures were so thin that they just tore apart, and basically the whole thing sort of stuck to the cast. The cast tore out the mold, and I was not able to use that mold anymore because the material just could not be removed from the silicone fissures. So I decided to make a second attempt, and this time using clay to do a sort of a two-part mold. I made up a clay wall and vacuum degassed my material. I used a dental syringe to bring the silicone into the various fissures, and then brushed mold and poured on the first layer. And then I used strengthening materials again, and then poured on the second layer, and a third thickened layer using Urafil for the, and then used key parts from other previous molds. And then COVID-19 hit, and I had to take everything from the office I was at back over to my garage because I really wanted to continue working on it. So here I am in my garage, getting the materials ready for the second, or the part 2 of my mold. So I removed the clay and then turned it upside down and used a sort of a wall from a corrugated sign and build up another clay wall, and put in my vent holes and got everything ready to pour. So I got the 2 parts ready to do mold, and it came out great. The brain popped out of there. Now there's some spots that were sort of captured, and I was able to cut through them. and put the brain back in its bucket, and then washed everything out and dried it all real well. Using liquid mold release, I got it everywhere it could possibly be, and all the molds, all the parts, and then mixed everything up and got it ready to cast. And once again, the brain cast stuck to the mold and actually ripped out portions of the mold. And also the material had huge bubbles on one side. I'm really frustrated with having to do all these huge tests, and so I decided to use a sheep brain to try a resin type mold. Made 2 boxes and split the sheep brain in half to both hemispheres, and then filled up the rest of the material of the box with spray foam. And once those were out, I used clay to sort of make the brain halves hollow, and I was able to pour the material in and then use the clay to make those voids. And then I used some other silicone to glue them back together. And then I used some smooth on pigment, fill in some of the areas to make it look like it was the previous brain. And it turned out pretty good. So I said, well, I could probably do that with my other brain that I had been using. And so I made a box for it and filled it with resin and used all the strengthening materials and everything. Filled that up with spray foam. And cut off the spray foam so it'll be flat. Removed the box. And then was able to take off the brain. This was a little bit harder because dealing with a hard mold was a lot harder to deal with, trying to get the brain out. But once I did, I poured the new material in, and there were some bubbles on the one side, and then I was able to easily sort of pull out the cast. But it did break the main mold in some areas. Some areas were broke, but what I loved about it is that all the fissures were still intact. You could actually sort of open the brain like you would like peel it apart. But all these pieces were broken, and I have to figure out a different way to do this. So, my 7th mold, my 4th attempt at a cadaver brain, I tried to use a kind of a clay wall with wax in the bottom, and then build that up using my resin mold. Now I could easily remove the wax and then make another clay wall to pour my material into, made all the vent holes and everything. Pried that open, and the materials trying to get out of that was another job, trying to remove it all. But there was still some really thin parts of the brain. I ended up strengthening them with more resin. And once I got it all ready to go, I poured in the material. Got the cast out, and it also had tore pieces out of the mold. There was bubbles on top, but they probably could have been filled in. And I mean, one side turned out okay, but I can't use the mold again. So I said, how can I make this cast all in one piece? And so I used silicone spacers so that the mold would have stronger thin areas. And I stuck sticks into the high points of the brain to provide vent holes, and poured the material in. I noticed that the brain floated to the top, so I needed to weight it down. And then once it was ready, I pulled out the sticks. I scallop cut the mold, and we had to remove the brain, and part of the brain sort of was stuck in there. Basically, it had to be sort of cut out. Once I got everything out, then I was able to pour resin into the silicone mold. So now I had a plastic cast of the brain, but as you can see, it pulled out portions of the mold. So the question is, how can I make this brain cast in one piece? I used a Dremel tool to Dremel down some of the areas, and this was a problem that near the whole surface was covered by these little pits, and so I had to use glazing putty to fill them in. Using a syringe full of more resin, I was able to fill in some of the voids, the air bubbles in there, and then I was still continuing to pull out silicone that was trapped in all the fissures. What I wanted to do is basically fill up those fissures with modeling clay, and so I used Sculptex clay to fill in a lot of these fissures, but my question was, how was I going to create this mold so that it would be pulled out of a cast easily? A hard cast out of a semi-rigid mold is what I was planning, so I used some material to see how this would work, and the smooth cast 45D bubbled up in areas. I think I didn't let the mold release dry long enough before I put the 45D on, and it bubbled up. 45D has a big problem with moisture, so that was its problem right now. So my question is to you, how can I make 25 casts of this resin mold? Should I keep it one piece, or should I break it up into 3 pieces? But each piece must be totally encapsulated. This is a really difficult problem for me. I need your advice. Thank you.